Now we'll turn to our panel that will delve further into Brazil's economic and political prospects. Moderators for this panel are Paulo Vieira da Cunha of Verbank Consulting and Drauzio Giacomelli of Deutsche Bank Securities.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel. First priority is to overcome the pandemic and recover the economy. A second priority is to support those most critically affected, those who lost or will lose their sources of income. Key issue, and the third priority, is respect for the budgetary institutions, including the constitutional mandate on a ceiling for public expenditures. It is this mandate that anchors fiscal expectations. Yet the mandate is being threatened, even as the public debt climbs to near 100% of GDP. Congressional approval of another regime of public calamity, as in 2020, allowing for extra ceiling expenditures, would most certainly destabilize expectations and possibly lead to a financial crisis.
Thank you, Paulo, very much. It's really an honor for me to be here. Well, Brazil is kind of decoupling from the rest of the world right now. What we are seeing is that the rest of the world is continuing to grow, gradually leaving the pandemic, progressing with the vaccination, and Brazil is a kind of lagging behind on this trend. We are actually worsening the pandemic. We are hitting record highs on death and hospitalizations. The economy is going into a double dip on recession. Probably going to see very dark numbers on growth, actually on contraction in March and April because of the new restrictive measures that governments are taking. And this is happening not only because of the worsening of the pandemic, but also because of the fiscal situation that Brazil is in. Compare Brazilian exchange rate to Latin American countries like Mexico, Peru, Chile. What you're seeing is that those countries, they had a steep depreciation in the beginning, but their currency strengthened with the higher commodity prices. And this didn't happen with Brazil. We are almost 30% weaker than we were in the beginning of the pandemic. To say that we are lagging behind on vaccination, but we are investing on that. We are quite constructive on vaccination prospect for the second half of this year. So we may see a second half more balanced and with some better prospects that we are seeing right now.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again. The ministerial reform itself and the approach to the budget demonstrates that the power of the legislative towards the presidential palace and the executive is higher than the presidential palace itself believed it should be when they were negotiating the support to the Speaker of the House, Arthur Lira, and to the President of the Senate, Rodrigo Pacheco. We can see that the biggest decisions and the dynamics of the speed in which the government operates depends much more on the decision-making that emerges in the legislative rather than the decision-making that emerges in the presidential palace. What does this tell us? It tells us that the speed in which things are going to advance in terms of reform and in terms of reforms and other important points that will come up in the Congress depends much more of the articulation and negotiation between key members of the legislative rather than the decision-making and the key names in the executive. Legislative, we have decision makers that they are more linked to the municipalities than to the president. So the basis of support is much larger. The executive tends to link to the abstract generality. This is why the narrative is important to the executive, and this is why the execution and amendments and money in terms of operating in support for specific municipalities is important to the centrist parties.
Hi, Paulo. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope. And the way that we look at, of course, across the very different emerging markets, including Brazil, but looking particularly in the past year, we're looking at three major factors. First, how well those countries have handled the pandemic, not only in terms of how low or how bad was the impact on activity, but also how quickly it can return and go back to normal. Second is how expensive was the response to the pandemic. Pretty much every country had to do some kind of fiscal or measure or credit measure to, of course, move out the impact on the population and also more spending on healthcare and so on. And the degree of magnitude varies quite a bit between countries. And then thirdly, it's important to see how much room those countries have now to if as things go back to normal, to help the economy go, to impulsionate the economy back to normal. How much room they have on the monetary side and on the fiscal side after all those measures that were done in last year. And unfortunately, Brazil doesn't look like that good in any one of those three major factors. First, the pandemic. Of course, as we know, the pandemic has taken a very heavy toll on Brazil in terms of the health and the death and everything. The new strains are really challenging the response. The country is still, of course, facing an increasing number of cases, even though most countries are now over it. As Minister Guedes said, the impact on activity was not as bad as other countries, and that's positive. But then, given that the pandemic is not over, it's really hard to see a very quick return to normal unless vaccination really speeds up. And I think that might be the bright side in Brazil, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. But overall, the pandemic, the response in Brazil has not been very positive. The second is on the fiscal side, particularly, Brazil was the country across emerging markets, was the country that has the biggest and the largest fiscal response to the pandemic. The magnitude of the support that was done to the households and to the corporate was really, really high. It was basically similar order of magnitude to Germany. And of course, this is understandable from a social perspective, and I'm not really judging that, but Brazil basically spends all the buffers that it has built in the past years, right? Since Dilma and presidency, and then with Temer, the pension reform, the fiscal debt ceiling, all those structural reforms that helped Brazil regain credibility and helped Brazil put the debt trajectory in a more stable sense, those are now spent by the pandemic response. And that leads to the third factor, which is Brazil has no room, right? Brazil has no room on the fiscal to do anything else. So if the pandemic worsens, Brazil actually needs to tighten fiscal policy quite aggressively from here. And so there's basically no room for further response, and there will be pressure for further response if the things worsen. And then on the monetary side, Brazil is actually facing an inflation problem and starting to see central bank credibility being erased. We're seeing inflation break-evens above the top end of the inflation target from the central bank. We're seeing long-end inflation expectations from the Focus survey starting to keep higher. It's not as bad as it was in the past, probably 6 years ago when the expectations were really above the target, but it's clear that the central bank needs to respond and has already done that by tightening policy in a quicker pace than expected.
Thank you. It has been a great morning, and I think that my colleagues have also brought very important and critical, say, perceptions to the reality that we're living today. I think that a bit like you, Paulo, said, we've been that before, and I have to say, I was in government back in 2002 when things looked so terrible, so impossible. When you think that today it's true, we have a larger domestic debt, but you have a smaller foreign debt, and you have about 10 times more reserves. Surprisingly, like Ismael was just said, our exchange rate is very, very depreciated, making every asset in Brazil cheap for international investors. So we have to look at the current situation with a little bit of, say, a cool approach. And of course, the problems are very real. We had never faced a crisis like this. It's a global crisis. It's quite remarkable that institutions in Brazil continue to make a difference. We heard several people, starting with the minister, said, look, we are just vaccinating 1 million people a day, which frankly, few countries are doing that. Even in Europe, the rate is not that much higher than that. And if you compare with other developing countries, you don't have this. So I believe that we have a lot of challenges in the months ahead. The next 2 months will be very difficult. We have to have some sort of lockout. Unfortunately, as Brazil never does something very completely, you don't get all the gains that a real lockdown will bring you. But anyway, we need to do it as the vaccination improves. We hope to have these 100 million shots by at the end of May. So in June, we'll be in a different situation. You'll be the right time for the central bank to reassess how much further you might need to go in terms of interest rates. We have to think that our yield curve is very steep, but then it's the yield curve of Russia, it's the yield curve of even of Mexico and other countries, in part because of the big challenge that is ahead with all the expansion in the US, both expansion of GDP with all the expectation of private investment that is associated to it, as well as the expansion of the government with the new debt that is expected to it.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, everybody. We'll move to a rapid fire, as you said, in the last 15, 20 minutes of this panel. And I'd like to ask the panelists to look into the future and help guide us where you think Brazil is heading, because we've talked a lot about where we stand. So it's time to do this exercise of looking ahead. And I think to start, we need to acknowledge where we are in the kind of world that we are currently. It's not as easy as it used to be. We are coming from more than a decade of very shallow cycles, wobbles in the global economy and solid trend in growth without much volatility. And now it's possible that we'll face policy mistakes at the core. We'll probably see very strong acceleration in growth. It may require a stronger response from monetary authorities. And that may create an environment where we leave the wobbles and go to cycles that they were before the financial crisis. That's more volatility. EM doesn't like volatility. Brazil, with this most concerning fiscal situation, will not like volatility. So that's one thing that we have to acknowledge, that the world has become less forgiving. Hopefully we don't see the kind of inflation we fear and things go as planned, but we have to take that into account, that investors may become more selective. And in this world of investors becoming more selective, I think Brazil has to find a way of differentiating itself. It is true that Brazil really needs higher savings, as was discussed before. Private savings is insufficient. Public savings is still the norm. So we need external savings as well. And unfortunately, Brazil has been the ugly duck in the capital flows arena. So it needs to find be able to differentiate itself. And how could that be done? Well, you look around and investors like to see a country with 6+ % growth rate, and the country that's discussing structural reforms and infrastructure, and you look around and you conclude that these emerging markets is the US. It shouldn't be, right? The US is the country now that we expect to grow at 6+, and that they are talking about infrastructure packages, etc. So we want to EM countries like Brazil to post results like EM used to, high growth, reforms, and better prospects. I think we had that, and Joaquin was part of it. In the late 90s, we're able to implement reforms. Brazil is very good at devising rules, but not as good as following the rules. So I think we had many good fiscal rules introduced. I think they have been improved, and But rather than creating more rules, I think it would be good to start following them and put these fiscal concerns aside and focus on what matters, what can promote growth.
Have made important reforms recently. We made privatizations. We did a very important labor reform 2 years ago. We did the social security reform. We are changing the framework, the legal framework for important sectors, so sanitation, railways, cabotage. And so those are things that may attract and should attract foreign investors to the country, regardless the political cycle, regardless the economic cycle. So for instance, sanitation is important, and we have opportunities here, regardless if the country is growing 5 or 1. So I think that this could be a driver for growth in the future, and but we need more, and especially on the tax front. Tax reform is crucial, and I don't see tax reform being approved in the short run. Unfortunately, I think that Brazil is not mature enough for that. We have to discuss more. Everybody agrees that we need a tax reform, but nobody agrees on what reform. Each one has your own tax reform in mind, so we have to discuss more as a society to move forward on that.
In Brazil, politicians, they tend to be right-wing and left-wing during the electoral periods, and then there is this huge magnet, which is the parliament, that makes them centrists when they become presidents, when they start to govern. So in the near future, I see the reform advancing, but not necessarily being concluded. I see a hard stop next year in the legislative agenda around May, June. And the election between left and right will be a narrative between left and right, in which the power of the narrative at the moment, especially on the transmission of fear from one side to the other, is what will generate the final result. In Brazil, and as in the US as well, people are strengthening groups or joining each other around what they hate, not around what they want or what they love. So the electoral and the political world is similar. So the bigger the rejection towards Bolsonaro will benefit Lula. If Bolsonaro is able to manage a larger rejection towards Lula, he will benefit. So it's the confluence of rejection rather than the confluence of acceptance.
The fact is that in part because we're big, because we do have some flexibility, we have so far managed to overcome this challenge, but we cannot be complacent. And I think, for instance, in the case of the tax reform, is very much applicable. As Thiago said, everybody has in mind what is the tax reform. By coincidence, I was just looking at my screen a few minutes ago. All the Secretary of Finance of all the 27 states have just issued a letter today to Congress say, please, and actually to the minister, please move ahead with the tax reform. Now, we need the leadership of the minister, we need the leadership of the president, and you also need the leadership of the private sector.
Those were very worthy 2 minutes and a great 2 minutes to finish and wrap up this excellent panel. I thank you very much for your great presentations. Thank you all.